Good morning. Glad to be able to share with you this morning. And although it's Mother's Day, I want to start by reminding you of something else that usually happens around this time of year. Perhaps something you're not as excited about as Mother's Day, and that is most of us have just finished up with getting our taxes all paid and straightened around and taken care of. I notice we don't have any special celebration for that, though. But we all have to do it, right? Now, I want to ask you a question and be honest. Have you ever thought about not doing it? Forget that tax stuff? Probably not. And why do you suppose that might be? Penalty. Yeah, there's a penalty. You know, all right, you're only going to get away with that so long before somebody somewhere is going to show up and force the issue, right? And so there are some things that we do because we're forced. All right, there are some things you don't have a choice because someone bigger and stronger and more powerful is going to make you do whatever it is. All right, now I know there are civil and philosophical discussions that we could have about taxes that sort of add some nuance to that. But, you know, if we don't pay them, we're going to be forced to do it. All right. Now, today is Mother's Day. And so I thought I would ask is, for those of you who are mothers or who had mothers, which should pretty well cover everyone in the room, did you ever have a time where your mother forced you to do what you were supposed to do? That ever happened? Now, if you are a mother, did you ever have to force your kids to do whatever it was they were supposed to do? Once in a while. All right. Now, you know, every parent knows that that's a necessity from time to time, that we've got to sometimes force our kids to do the right thing. However, let me ask you this follow-up question. When were you the most proud of them? When you stood over them and made them step by step do the thing that they were supposed to do? Or perhaps was it when you weren't there and you came later and discovered that they had done what you would want them to do in that situation? Yeah. I hope we're all saying the latter, right? Of course. And so when we think about obedience, this is what I want to talk about today, and why we obey. One of the things we really need to get out of that is what matters the most in that situation is not that we strictly follow a set of rules. All right? I know there are situations in which, yeah, we have to follow the set of rules, right? We just talked about doing taxes, and you got to write the right number in the right box on the right page, right? And there's a list of rules a mile long about how everything has to be calculated. Okay, there are times when we have to do it. All right, but it's far better when our obedience comes from our hearts. When we do what we're supposed to do, when we do the right thing, because we know it's the right thing. And so I want to take a look at some passages of Scripture. And one of the things I hope to do this morning, as you know, a secondary point at least, is to demonstrate that this is always what God has wanted. All right, sometimes I hear people talk as if, right, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, somehow it's a different God. Where back in the Old Testament, God was just all about keeping rules and punishing you if you didn't keep them. But then in the New Testament, you know, he kind of got a new lease on his whole approach to mankind and decided that wasn't going to be the thing anymore. But I would challenge you just to think about that for a few minutes. And I'll bet you can, even without me saying anything, I'm going to say something, but even without that, you would be able to go, wait a second, it does look like God always wanted the hearts of his people. Right? Consider a passage we all know very well. Jesus says it in Mark chapter 7, but he's quoting from Isaiah chapter 29, and he says, "This people honors me with their lips, but" what?
Their hearts.
"But their hearts are far from me." And that's the problem, right? That's the issue that Isaiah was drawing out. In the book of Hosea, the whole book, I would argue, is a demonstration of the kind of relationship that God wants with his people. And so in the book of Hosea, we don't have time to cover the whole book, but it's a great book. You should definitely read it after this. But in Hosea chapter 2, and really this is an extended analogy through the book, God compares Israel to an unfaithful wife. Right? Not to a disobedient servant, not to, a subject, but to a wife. Why does he choose that comparison? Well, because he wants us to understand, and he wanted them to understand, the betrayal involved in disobedience. He wants to illustrate how it feels when someone you've devoted yourself to just completely throws that away. And that's what he's saying to them. And so in Hosea chapter 3, God has Hosea act out his relationship with the people when Hosea's wife goes off with another man. And God says to Hosea, now you go and take her back. In chapter 4, God says, I've got a problem. I've got a complaint against the people of Israel. He says, there's no faithfulness or steadfast love in the land. And in verse 6 of that chapter, he says, my people, this is the one we often hear quoted, right? My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Now what's important to grasp there is the word knowledge is yada there. And it means intimate knowledge. The way you know a close friend or companion. Right? The problem wasn't that the people of Israel had not memorized enough scriptures. It was that they didn't know God as a person. And because of that, God says they were destroyed. Earlier, when God was setting up the kingdom, he said in 1 Samuel chapter 13 that he was looking for what kind of a man to lead his people. Can you remember? David was called a man after God's own heart. And that's what qualified him to rule. That's what made him so special. Now, I'm well aware of 1 Kings 15, where it says he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But the idea is that David doing what was right came out of his love and devotion to God. In Micah, we have the people of Israel who are guilty before God. And there's this rhetorical question, what can we do to restore the damage that's been done? What can we do to repair the relationship? And in verse 8 of Micah chapter 6, he says, He's told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require, but for you to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your God. And so the Old Testament is filled with the teaching that God wants the hearts of his people, and that he wants their obedience to be a response to the relationship that they have. Not to be just a strict adherence to a list of rules. Jesus addresses this in the Sermon on the Mount. Probably many of you, and of course, for those of you who've been in the small groups, we just finished talking about this. There's a whole section in Matthew chapter 5 from verses 21 to 48 where Jesus says, you've heard it said, and then how does he follow that up? But I say unto you, right? And the subjects he addresses there are things that can express themselves in a physical act, right? He says, well, you've been told you shouldn't kill anybody, right? You shouldn't murder. But let me tell you, that's not enough. And in fact, God wasn't just looking for you to know enough not to kill one another. What he was looking for is for you to love one another. And so he says, don't hate. Right? Don't lust. Right? Instead of taking oaths, right, making elaborate promises, what if you just were honest? Right? The characteristics that God has always wanted. And by the way, just to make this clear at this point, consider the fact that when Jesus delivers the Sermon on the Mount, okay, this is during the Jewish age. In order to be right with God at that time, you needed to be a faithful Jew. Right? The church hadn't started yet. And so Jesus says all these things to people who were living as Jews and who were beholden to the law of Moses. Jesus explains in Mark chapter 7 that what comes out of a person is what defiles him. Now, just to give you a little bit of context there, the discussion was being had about food. Okay, and as you know, the Jews had very strict rules about what they could eat and couldn't eat, right? We're all kind of aware of that. And so Jesus comes along and says, it's not what goes into a person that defiles him. You know, imagine his audience sitting there going, what? Yes, it is. Right? We know, look, there's all these things you're not supposed to eat, and if you eat them, you'll be unclean. That's defiled. And so Jesus says, it's what comes out of a person that's what defiles him. From within, out of the heart of man, comes evil thoughts and sexual immorality and theft and murder and adultery and covetousness and wickedness and deceit and sensuality and envy and slander and pride and foolishness. All these evil things come from within, he says, and they defile a person. And so, even in the Old Covenant, God was looking for us to change. Not just what we did. Okay? He wasn't asking us to say, well, let's stop keeping this list of rules and let's change and start keeping this list of rules. He was asking us to change our hearts, who we are. I heard a story about a lady who was a devoted and skilled gardener. All right, and every year about this time, she would be taking the little plants that she had carefully started from seeds in the house, and she'd take them outside to the garden that she'd pre-prepared and fertilized, and she'd have everything ready. Then she had a little structure built there so that she could cover her garden with plastic to protect it from the frost and give the plants a good head start. And on one occasion, just in that week where it was really important to make that transition and get all the plants in the garden, she had to be away for a work commitment. And so her older kids decide, well, Mom's going to be away to do this. I know it's really going to bother her, so let's go ahead and we'll get Mom's garden ready and we'll get everything planted that she has worked so hard to plant. And so Mom's away and they show up at the house to get everything done. And Mom's left a list with a little bit of a diagram there showing where in the garden, the onions should go and the carrots and broccoli and whatever else she's got based on, which parts of the garden tend to hold a little more water and which parts get more sunlight. And she's kind of got it all thought out for them. And they take the list and they kind of look at it and, okay, well, Mom says the broccoli should go here, but I don't know. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think we should put it over there. And so they put the broccoli over there. And the onions are supposed to go here. I don't know where she comes up with this stuff. Let's just put it over there. And, they kind of work through the list and they get everything planted. Now, it just so happens, by the way, that the carrots, they kind of look at what Mom said and they look at the garden and they go, yeah, that seems like a good spot for carrots. And so they go ahead and they put the carrots in the spot where Mom had told them. But not much else was where it was supposed to be. Now, I want to ask you, as those kids planted the garden, when did they obey their mother? With the carrots, I would suggest they didn't obey her at all. Because the only reason they put the carrots where they were supposed to go is they thought that was fine. They thought it was a good idea. The problem was, right from the start, they didn't trust their mother. They didn't think that she knew best and that they should, therefore, put everything where she had directed them to put it. You see, obedience, true, proper obedience, comes out of love and trust. And as soon as you decide to filter all the instructions through your own good sense, it stopped being obedience. Right now you're just doing what you think is right. Now that's not always a bad thing. If you're reading Facebook, right, probably 80% of what you read on there is nonsense. So you better put it through your own sense, right? You better filter it. But when God tells us something, we don't need a filter. We're supposed to trust Him. We're supposed to be able to say, look, I know that He created this world and me and everything in it, and He knows what's best, and so I'm going to live that out in my life. That's going to be demonstrated through my obedience. Now, by the way, this is going to be really quick, this last section. Just to alleviate those of you who are thinking, Kevin, you really missed it here because the New Testament says a lot about obedience too. You're right. Okay, there's no debate about that whatsoever. In fact, you could probably argue that it says as much as the Old Testament does. So I'm not going to give you all of them, but look at that list. All right, and we'll just touch on 2 or 3. But in Luke 6:46, Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I tell you?" In 1 John 3:24, we read, "Whoever keeps His commandments abides in God, and God in him." James warns us to be doers of the word and not hearers only. Right? And we could go on, and I didn't even give you, I ran out of space to get the rest of the verses in there. There's more and more and more. I want to leave you with this. Do you guys remember the story in Acts chapter 5? Begins in verse 17 where the apostles are preaching, and the temple guards come along and arrest them. Do you remember this? They get arrested and they're taken away and they get put in prison. Now they're put in prison for the night and the council's going to meet the next day to figure out what to do with these jokers. But in the night, an angel comes along, opens the prison and tells them, go back to the temple and keep preaching. And so they go back to the temple and begin to continue to preach what they've been doing the day before. Now, while they're there preaching in the temple, the council meets, and the council, they're talking about what we ought to do, and they say, well, let's call those prisoners up here, and we'll give them what for. So the guards go down to the prison to get the prisoners. No prisoners. Right, where'd they all go? So they investigate a little bit, and they find out, here's the apostles back in the temple preaching, which is exactly what we arrested them for yesterday. So they arrest him again and they take him to the council chambers. And you remember, what does the council say? Right? We strictly charged you not to teach any more in this name. Right? And then we come down here and you filled all Jerusalem with your teaching. And you kind of can picture these guys, getting scolded by the Jewish high council. And it tells us that Peter and the rest of the apostles answered them in what way? Can you recall?
We must obey God rather than men.
We must obey God rather than men. And you hear that story and you think, what a story of victory and courage in the face of danger and adversity. What a great example of faithful obedience that the apostles demonstrated for us, even to defy the Jewish high council, who had just arrested them now twice. But for us, every day, there's not going to be a council. There's not going to be anyone arresting you or cutting your head off or beating you or any of those things. But you and I are going to have to decide whether or not we have the courage and the conviction and the dedication to obey God rather than men.